automated testing experience at various companies. I have been a principal QA engineer, QA manager, automation engineer. Really, my heart and soul is just trying to make QA engineers' jobs easier. People always ask me, what's an SDET? What is a software developer test? And I just tell them it's really just lazy QA. It's really, you want to make your job as easier as possible, and I think that by using automated test solutions, you can really do that. I have 8 years experience with Water, which is web application testing in Ruby, and over a year with Selenium now. Today's agenda will be a quick introduction on Selenium, like what is Selenium, tips and tricks for this tool, and pitfalls to avoid. One of the reasons for this talk is at EID Passport, we actually had a Selenium test project that was known to be a little bit brittle, unreliable, and EID was getting ready to toss it out the window because they could not use the results. And I said, well, let me take a look at it. Let me see what I can do. Let me see if I can make this something you can count on. As Sabrina mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them as we go along here. I don't mind going through questions and answers as we go through. If you would like to, you can also hold them to the end, and I will tackle some there. So I mentioned Water. So what is it? It's web application testing in Ruby. And I was doing work with web apps 8 years ago, 10 years ago, and the tools that were out there for automated web testing were either super expensive because they were commercial products using vendor scriptware, or you had this thing called Selenium 1, which I didn't like, for reasons I'll go into later on. But the Ruby aspect of it really was the libraries. You were able to interact with web pages. You didn't have to put in a sleep for the page transitions. Another great thing about Ruby was it's an open source project, which meant that it was the right price. It was free, and it was pretty reliable. And when it first came out, it really was for IE, but as it grew, they added support for other web browsers. So for me at the time, it was a nice tool to have in the toolbox. Well, what is Selenium? Again, it's a different open source project that can be used to automate web browsers. And I love it because whenever you're testing web apps, you're going to have to go through regression testing. And in this case, you can handle many different browsers. Another reason why I love using automated test tools is if I have, for example, an admin website and I need to create users, change permissions, and I don't want to do that manually, I may just use something like Selenium to do that work. It's not necessarily an automated test, but it is a task that has to be done through a web browser. And if there's a way for me to automate it, I'm going to try it, mainly just to save time.
Alan,
so,
you might have a quick question here on the Selenium. You mentioned it's used for web browsers only. Are there some browsers it works well with and then others not so well?
Yeah, I'll get to that, Steve, in another slide. But in general, I would say that it works pretty well for all the browsers in general. But IE definitely is the tricky one. And it's kind of funny because at EID Passport, our website, our customers for that are all internal. Our customers for our website are inside customer support, so rather on the phone. So we actually have control of what browser that we support. And we happen to support IE10, which is super awesome. And that's one of the reasons why it was brittle. IE is, if you ever look at the size of the download, IE10 or earlier, the size of the download was actually rather large because they tried to put in some smart capabilities to try to guess what you're doing. Because it's a Microsoft product, it's a big target, so they claim to put a lot of security in their browser as well. When we talk about WebDriver, we'll see that IE didn't really have a lot of native support for it, and the IE driver for Selenium kind of reflects that. It has some weird things in it where you think you're doing something to the browser, and it'll work in the other ones, but in IE, it kind of doesn't work all the time. Selenium comes with native support for Firefox, which is really nice, and Chrome, it works really well too, and they're fast. But when it comes down to driving IE in general is a little bit slower. The older versions especially, and you can see that when you're running the automation.
Right.
I'll be talking a little more about the browsers in a little bit, but in general, I would say IE is the trickiest one of them all.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So people always ask me, well, you had Selenium in the past and you had Water in the past, so why one over the other? And at this moment in time, it's kind of my choice. People can use either one. They're going to accomplish the same types of things. Water, like I said, was around for almost a decade now. And at the time, I thought it was a better choice than Selenium. Right now, both are being backed up by WebDriver. It's kind of a toss-up as far as which one's better. I would say that Selenium has more support out in the wild. If you ever Google Selenium, you're going to get, I would say, more hits that come up with it as opposed to Google search using Water. They're both fine tools. Selenium also, I think, had more bindings available. Water, by definition, is Ruby. With Selenium, you can have bindings in Java, C#, Python, also Ruby. So there's a lot more languages that you can choose from. So at this moment in time, I would choose Selenium over Water for basically the more bindings that are available, so you have a choice of language, and the fact that it does appear to be more widely supported out there. So if you get stuck, there's going to be people you can talk to get some answers. But mainly it comes down to choice and what you're comfortable with.
Alan, Steve here again. I just a quick question.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, for Selenium and Water, are there opportunities or situations where they can be used together, or are they mutually exclusive by the way they operate?
They're not mutually exclusive, but I really don't recommend mixing the technologies. You'll be using multiple libraries to accomplish the same thing. So I would say choose one or the other, but not both. They both have method calls and interfaces that do exactly the same things, though. And if you know one tool, whether it's Selenium, that should not be that difficult to move over to the other. In my opinion, the Water interface is a little more cleaner as far as readability is concerned, but anybody with a decent programming background should be able to pick it up pretty quickly. Or even if you don't have a programming background, if you understand the concepts of what creates a web page and you're comfortable with reading HTML and understand the way that a web doc is structured, it's not too far of a leap. It's not like learning something from scratch. So as far as integrating the two, I don't recommend it. I would say choose one or the other. But play with both. If you're new and just starting out, play with both, see which one you like better. But keep in mind the supportability and what language you're going to be more comfortable with, because Water is Ruby specific.
Right, but I think from the flavor of the webinar, the tilt is towards Selenium.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I wanted to give a little bit of background of what I came from and how I started this decision to come to Selenium.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. So we mentioned regression testing, and that's one of the big things that we use automated web testing for, or just automated testing in general. It's anytime you're going to have a repetitive test effort. Why repeat yourself over and over again? Why spend that time just proving that something still works? I'd rather have a machine do that for me. Another great thing about Selenium is that you can test across many browsers. In fact, you can reuse the same code and just say, use Firefox, use Mozilla, use Netscape Navigator. Just kidding. But you can say, this is my browser, run these tests against that. And regression testing is very time consuming. Again, I'd rather use my time and on a task that I feel is a little more valuable. And sometimes that's exploratory manual testing, but usually it's going to be to create test automation so someone else can do something else. Not just myself, but a fellow QA engineer. So I mentioned that it's not just for testing. You can use this for automation of web-based admin tasks. So, for example, at a different company I was working at, we had to create a lot of data just to set up the testing. But there was a pattern I found I could use, so I created something, happened to be in Ruby, to go against an admin portal, and I just created users with different permissions. And this setup script, if I did it manually, would have taken me days. But because I was able to create some automation around that, I just ran it overnight. I came in, I had lots of data, users with a variety of different permissions that needed to be tested. And that was pretty sweet, because I showed my bosses that this saves that much time. They understood it. And I showed them the test plan. I said, here's what I'm going to do with these users. And they loved it. But you also can use automation for lots of different things. And I'm not going to read the slide, but you get the idea. You basically CRUD your data, create, read, update, delete of your records, and have that repeatable, reliable. And it may not be the test itself, maybe just part of the test, but it's just one step closer to the final goal. So what version of Selenium? I would say that 8-10 years ago, Selenium was around, but it was Selenium 1.0, also known as Selenium IDE. So I do want to caution you when you do your Google searches on Selenium, just double check to see what version they're talking about. Version 1.0 had a recorder, which has been deprecated, no longer in use. One of the big reasons why I did not like Selenium at the time was Selenium 1.0 uses JavaScript injection to drive a browser. And I didn't want to give the developers any reason whatsoever when the test failed for them to say, oh, it failed because of that JavaScript that you put on the web page. So that was, at the time, a big reason why to use Water. But now, Selenium 2 doesn't do that. It uses WebDriver. What is WebDriver? That's a good question. I'm not going to read this slide. I gave you a link so you can find out more about it. But in general, what WebDriver does is exposes interfaces so it can drive a browser using native language. And the best thing about that is it's actually driving the browser with itself. And WebDriver is just a very powerful tool to accomplish that. Selenium sits on top of that, and that's the layer that we talk to. So you don't need to say, oh, this is IE specific, this method is Firefox specific, this is Chrome specific. You actually just write Selenium code, Selenium talks to WebDriver, WebDriver will talk to the browser. And that's all done magically. If you want to read more information about the specifics, WebDriver is now part of the W3 spec, and they actually have information about it there. So, yes?
Yeah, just real quick. You mentioned the Selenium 1.0 and 2.0. Are you aware of any 3.0 versions in the pipeline?
I do know that they are working on some things. I don't know the specifics. Like I said, this is an open source project, so there are basically a couple mailing lists. One of them would be for users where they can ask some questions, much like a message board, but they have that. But there's also a dev side for the contributors, people who are writing Selenium, contributing to the code base. So I don't have any specifics right now about what's coming down the pike, but I did hear a rumor that this year's 2015 Selenium conference actually will be held here in Portland, Oregon. This is pretty new. I found this out last week talking to friends, but we don't have any specifics about dates or times. But if you look online for the Selenium Conference 2015. May not be up there now, but double check on it in the near future. And maybe you guys can come visit me in Portland.
Excellent.
So we have, I'm assuming, a variety of different types of people in the audience, and some people may want to know, well, how do I start using Selenium? Well, the idea is pick a language first. If you have a language that you're more comfortable with, I would try it there. I would say that Selenium is very well supported under Java and C#. Whenever there's changes, those are going to be the two languages that are updated first. The libraries will be updated first. But they also offer support for Python and Ruby and other languages. So if you have a language in mind, pick it up. If none of your languages are supported, I would say try picking one of these other languages up. I find that the scripting languages like Python and Ruby are easier to pick up than something a little more structured like Java or C#. But all the languages have plenty of tutorials online so that you can learn. And the documentation on the Selenium website, Selenium HQ, you can choose what language you want your documentation to show up. So as long as someone has contributed to the documents for that language, you should be able to get great examples. And the other thing you can do is check out the unit tests that are shipped. If you download the source code, the unit test will give you some examples of how to call the code. So once you pick your language, it's up to you to pick up your browser. That's the second part of it. Like I said, Firefox is probably most closely associated with Selenium. Mainly, I would consider native support. Chrome does a great job. And then you have IE, Safari, and other things like Android Driver or Phantom.js. But you have plenty of choices for browsers. And that's one of the great things I love about Selenium is that if you have to support many different types of browsers, chances are they actually have a driver for that. So how do I interact with the browser? And I got a caveat here. I will be showing some code. In real life, most of the code will be inside try-catch blocks, just to make sure things are working. But for purposes of this webinar, I'll give you kind of snippets to give you an idea of how to use the code. And everything should compile, but they're not super robust if you were to use this code as is inside of your testing. But it's here to give you an idea. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that with the browsers nowadays, they come built-in developer tools. Normally, with the browser, you hit something like an F12, and it gives you tools that you can actually inspect your web pages. So that's been really handy. Back in the day, it was an add-on or a third-party program to help to let you inspect the code. But nowadays, I would say that each browser has realized that, oh, that's a pretty good tool to have, so they make that available as soon as you download it. So if you're familiar with HTML, you know about name attributes, ID attributes. Those are things you can use to go find different elements on the page. This particular code would try to find something by name, and the name would have an attribute called myButton, and it will look for that text on the page. And then once you have a handle to that, it would just click it. So if you can imagine a button, this is how you would write some code to click it. Now the last example is talking about a button, and the built-in locators inside Selenium are probably the best way to try to interact with different elements. These particular code snippets show you how to interact with elements by name, by ID, or by class name. But it's really up to your team to be sure that these attributes are actually embedded inside your HTML. If you're not using names or IDs or classes on your elements, then this particular way of finding elements will not go so well. But I would say that working in a small team, you should be able to justify the use of elements like that. So what happens if you are working with grumpy developers who don't want to put the time and effort into creating those things for you? You can always fall back to XPath or CSS selectors. This is just an example of an XPath expression, and below that is a CSS selector. The idea is if there is really nothing that's available easily, you can try to dig down into the page to find what you need. In the past, there was a big debate whether to use XPath or CSS, which one's better, and there was a rumor that XPath was slow and not very reliable, and CSS is better. Somebody did, I should have put a link here, but I don't have it. Somebody did an actual comparison trying to prove or disprove that one is faster than the other. And it turns out that the speed differences were actually not very big at all. And in the real world, you can expect them to behave just about the same. So I would say if anybody's talking about which one's faster or slower, that conversation doesn't really happen anymore. But it's really what you're more comfortable with using as a selector. They're both fine. They both can get you to the same place. It's more of a comfort level. So I wanted to present some tips just to avoid some headaches. As I said before, EID had some Selenium that was already in place, and it was thought to be fragile, brittle, unreliable, unusable, and they were ready to throw it out. And I wanted to present some tips on how to prevent your Selenium test automation from becoming shelfware. I would say that shelfware is the biggest problem with test automation projects. People create it, it runs great for a little while, people don't maintain them for some reason, and then they don't use it because they don't maintain it. Test automation really is a software project, and you have to think of it like that. You have to know that there is going to be a maintenance phase. If there is no maintenance in your budget for the test automation, then you're not treating it like a project. And I can pretty much say that that project will have a little bit of trouble as time moves forward. How do you prevent this from happening? There's lots of things you can do. One of the things I used at EID were unique locators. I would say when I came in, the code base did have some locators that were reliable and some of them that weren't. And that was one of the reasons why the test didn't always work, depending on what data was being returned on the page. If your locators are not unique, then it may not be deterministic on whether or not it will be on the page when you go look at it. Another problem I found were hard-coded index numbers. So if one guy was looking at a particular table, but looking at the third row, fourth column by indexing, how do you guarantee that that's going to work in the future? That really wasn't accounted for. So you really want to avoid using hard-coded index numbers, if at all possible, because there's no guarantee that the layout on the page will be the same. So that's where unique locators will come in. And if you don't have names, ID class, as I mentioned before, you ask for them from the development team. Everybody's on the same team. The goal is to make either the regression tests more reliable, make them more efficient. And I have worked with some great people, and that's usually not an issue. If it is an issue for you, I'm sorry. See what you can do to find a champion to help push your cause. Because I can't stress enough, having locators on the page available to you is going to make your job a lot easier. Another problem I saw in the test suite we had were a lot of hard-coded sleeps. EID's been around for over a decade, and the website kind of shows that in some places. And we tend to use a lot of JavaScript dialogues, pop-up windows, and I found that the test automation would just sleep and hope for the best. This is an example code. Sleep 5 seconds, and then click a button. Well, what happens if the pop-up window didn't show up within the 5 seconds? Test would fail miserably. Why? Hard-coded sleep. So the solution was to use a polling weight. Be flexible. Maybe poll every quarter of a second, have your button click inside a try catch block. If it's there and it succeeds, move on. If not, catch the exception, sleep for a quarter second, and then try again with some timeout in the future, like 10 seconds, for example. But inside that 10-second window, if you would just have a poll, sleep, check, catch exceptions, things will work out pretty well. Now, one thing that Selenium is really good for is it kind of has this built-in, something called the WebDriver wait. This one is this actual C# code will poll for 10 seconds, and I don't know what the polling interval is, but I think it is a quarter of a second. And it's going to, in this case, just wait until you get an element. And if that element, for some reason, does not exist, WebDriver wait will automatically catch it for you and try again. And after 10 seconds, if it didn't show up, it will throw an exception. But this gives you the ability to not write your own custom code, and it'll be a little more robust in handling web pages. Web pages are notorious for loading in different times, depending on what's coming over the wire, how busy network traffic is. It's very finicky. And it's one of the reasons why people go, oh, UI testing, brittle. And it's okay, sometimes maybe it's not as reliable as APIs are, but at the same time, when you're talking about driving something on the UI, I would say that it's more of an integration test. And integration tests in themselves need to have lots of different pieces all running happily. My analogy is you got to have these ducks on the wall, and every duck has to be sitting happy on the wall. If one duck falls over, all bets are off. So by using polling sleeps with driver wait, for example, it will help you robustify your test automation. More convenience methods are offered by Selenium using expected conditions. There are a ton of them, and here's a link to go look at them. Some of the expected conditions could be, is element visible, is element viewable, is element interactive, if you can interact with it. These are expected conditions you would think would be on a web page. So if the element's not there, if the expected condition would also poll for you. So you don't have to put in a hard code asleep. This is another example of a polling tool to help robustify your test automation. Another thing that we use at EID, and this was actually in the code base that we have here, is the use of a page object. Page objects are not new for Selenium. They've been around for a long time. But the idea is if any given web page changes and you have test scripts talking to the web page, they might have to change as well. Well, here you have separation of UI from test cases. So if the user interface changes at all, maybe they remove a button or they add buttons, or they move things around. The idea is the test cases themselves should still work once you modify the page object. And the biggest thing here is you're going to be reducing duplicate code. So I'm going to give you an example of a page object, and this is going to be a real simple one. Here is a login page. Pretty simple. Member name, password, and a sign-in button. I'm going to ignore the links for forget your member name, forget your password, but it's a pretty standard login page. An example page object might look like this. You're going to have, and this is C# code. Apologize if you're more comfortable in a different language, but this should be pretty readable. I have a login page there, and if I have a function here called login, where it's going to go find the username field and send information about username. If I have a password field, it's going to pass in some stuff to the password, and then you're going to have a submit button, and it's going to click it. What this function will take in is string username and string password. And the idea is like this is going to be your page object. What does the test script look like? It looks like this. I got a new login page. I'm going to pass in username, password, and I'm going to call the login function. And the idea is that if the login page changes for some reason, maybe they add another field for a security question, you don't have to necessarily modify the test scripts themselves. Maybe you have to pass in a third parameter. But all the heavy lifting would be here. You would change the login function to basically handle any changes on the UI. So there's separation there. Another big thing I wanted to just talk about is whenever you're dealing with UI automation, web specifically, you kind of want to verify your assumptions. You want to be sure that you are where you think you are. So I would say that on any page transition, make sure you verify that you have the elements that you have before you click on a button, and just double check it's there. Stick that in the try catch block, because if for some reason it's not there, it'll throw an exception, and it could cause your test to just block and fail, and then raise an error, and then it may be a cascading error. So by trying to show that if you're on the login page, hit the enter button, do you actually land on the home page for your app? Now, that's something to go check. If you are navigating using a menu bar, when you click on search page, are you actually there? Just verify some elements on the page before you actually try to interact with the page. Just verify that you're there. I have found that technique to be super helpful. Be generous with your logging. I can't say this enough, that when you click around things, just log where you're at. You'll get a pretty verbose log file, and you get to the point where your test automations run under a continuous integration, like under Team City, which we use here at EID. These things are running at night, unattended. You get a failure. The more verbose logging that you have, the easier it is for debugging to happen. Things I like to log, the URL of the page I'm on, timestamp, just to give me an idea of a feel of how long it took to get to certain places, and let me know if I see the same error happening in the same place at the same time every night. That might be a thing. Maybe there is a nightly job out there that's preventing things coming back in a timely manner. You just don't know. But the more information you have, the better. Any asserts that I have, I'll grab the values on them that are being used, values of comparators, and where I am inside loops. The only downside is that sometimes I get really verbose logs. But again, I think that disk space is pretty cheap. Why not log everything that you can? Talked about IE before. Sometimes click appears to do nothing, which is bad. And my solution is to use send keys instead of click. And I gave you a link to show that if you actually do the search, and it's going to be searching Google for IE click Selenium, you're going to get lots of results. So if you run into this problem, understand you're not the only one. So instead of using something like button.click, Steve?
Oh, sorry about that, Alan. I just one question on the IE trick you mentioned. Are there any others that we should be aware of, or a place to go find out about them?
I would say this is probably the worst one. There probably are others. I'm not so familiar with anything else because this is the one that caused me the most headaches.
Got it.
But yeah, so instead of using button.click, try button.sendKeys and do keys.enter. This has been proven pretty reliable, and this also works in the other browsers. So this is the #1 thing you're going to run into if you're driving Selenium with IE. So just keep this in mind. Try not to use click, use send keys, keys.enter, and things should be a lot better. And again, this is compatible across the browsers. Another thing I ran into at EID and other companies, like I said, we have a website that is about a decade old. We have frames sometimes. And if you're working with a site with frames, you have to realize that sometimes you got to switch the context of the browser. The browser normally is going to be at your root object, but if you need to deal with an element on a frame inside that page, you need to do something like a switch to that frame to change the context. And once you do that, you'll find that you are able to interact with the elements on that frame. If you don't switch context, you'll find that, hey, I can't find my button. I can't find my text field because you're not actually talking to the frame, you're talking to the frame set. So this is something that you just need to be aware of if you have frames on your site. EID, we had tons of these alert buttons, confirms, and other JavaScript prompts. This was a lot of fun. Yeah. How do I handle that? You can use switch to alerts. Now this is something that really it's really new for Selenium 2. Selenium 1 was awful for handling pop-ups. That actually was another reason why I didn't like Selenium 1, but Selenium 2 was a lot better. So here's some example code about finding that alert, switching to it. And I have here, I did show the try catch block to give you an example of an exception that you can try to catch. And this would be inside a method call that returns true or false, so whether or not it could find the pop-up. Sometimes we actually have windows that get opened. One thing that I like to do, and there's many ways to skin this cat, but I always try to give me the number of handles that are associated with my IE driver. And if I have more than one, and make sure it's not my base browser window, just go return it. So the meat of this particular example will be down at the bottom. Again, like with the dialogues that showed up before, you want to switch to it. You got to set the context of the driver so it knows what elements to interact with. In this case, I'm going to go find my pop-up window, switch my context to it. I'm going to do things on it. And once that window disappears, you do have to switch your context back to the main window. Because if you don't do that, you're going to start getting exceptions like window not found because your window has been dismissed. Well, when you're dealing with Selenium, sometimes it can't do everything. Sometimes you need to use something else. One tool I like to use is AutoIT. This is really, as far as I recall, a Windows-specific solution. I gave you a link here so you can go take a look at it. Some places where I had to use AutoIT were non-browser windows. We actually do have cases, not our main site, but other admin sites where we actually get a little pop-up that's not a browser window where we have to actually put in credentials. And Selenium doesn't really know how to deal with these. These are really like System32 dialogues from the Windows system. So I'll have to create interactions with AutoIT to go snoop and interact with these particular windows. Some things that are advanced topics I'm not going to get into today are how do you integrate Selenium test projects with continuous integration tools. That is something that I did here at EID. Took the Selenium automation and made it more reliable. And because it was more reliable, we could turn it into something that was run nightly. When tests are not reliable and you run them often enough, you're just going to get failures. And when you get too many failures that are actually red herrings, that's not really a lot of fun. So by solidifying the Selenium test first and proving that, yeah, we can trust these results, these things are reporting real errors, then you can try to trigger them off with a nightly build, which is something that we do. And it's proven quite valuable because then we know immediately in the morning how things happened overnight with the nightly build. Another thing you can do are remote controller tests and the Selenium grid. The Selenium grid, if you can imagine an army of computers, maybe with different browser configurations. So you have a test client that runs IE8, also might have a version of Firefox on it, another computer, IE9, with a different version of Firefox, and maybe with Chrome on it, a third box, IE10, so on and so forth. But you have a matrix of operating systems and browsers that you want to test against. You can set those machines up, and you can use Selenium Grid to let the master controller know about which browsers OS are available. And you can tell the controller, hey, for tonight's test, I want IE 10, I want Windows 7, Windows Vista. You can give it your attributes of what to test, and the grid will just take care of it, and it'll pick the machines out for you, and then run the tests, which is really nice. So you can maintain cross-browser compatibility pretty easily. Also, with the remote control, that's kind of part of it. It lets you run these tests remotely, and there is a remote Selenium driver that will do that for you. That's something I'm not going to cover here. You can always go online and find out more information, but I know that lots of companies do things of this sort. There are third parties out there like Sauce Labs that help you accomplish the same thing. I always describe Sauce Labs as outsourced Selenium Grid. They do all the maintenance of the machines for you. You just tell them what you want and spin them off. Selenium Grid you can do internally. It's a one-time layout of money, but there is a maintenance cost. So by using a service like Sauce Labs, you're kind of outsourcing that maintenance. The fee, I don't really know how much it costs to use Sauce Labs these days, but you know, that's the service that's out there and available for you. So in summary, the idea is you want to instrument your framework correctly and make the Selenium tests the best that they can be. If you're new to Selenium or even experienced user, you understand that you just need to try different things, see how the browsers behave under certain conditions, and don't be discouraged. You're going to run into roadblocks, but there's probably going to be a way around it. And the fact that Selenium is so well supported out there in the wild makes things a lot easier. And you can always just talk to friends. They probably run into very similar situations. Just have fun with it. Investigate, see what Selenium can do for you. It's a very powerful tool. The fact that it's open source means you can always extend it. It doesn't quite do what you want it to do. You also have a chance to contribute to the project. They're always looking for people to help out, especially on the documentation side. And with that, I want to mention again, when you do your searches in Google, just always verify that the page you're looking at deals with Selenium 2 and not Selenium 1. Even some of the most current results that come back are still dealing with people trying to use the IDE, trying to record. I would say that if that's coming up on the page, you can read it, take it with a big grain of salt, and realize that it's probably not going to be what you want to do. Here's my contact information. My current email, I can be found on LinkedIn as well. And I will be presenting at Better Software West in June. So if you are going to be attending that conference, say hello.
Hey, Alan, thanks a lot. Quick question from Steve here. On that last slide, you mentioned frameworks. Can you tell us a little bit more about the frameworks you design and any kinds of principles you follow?
Yeah, the frameworks really are something they're custom. It's something I've built through patterns I've seen. The biggest pattern I really use is the page object model, where I'm creating pages that deal with our site, what I'm separating functionality from UI. And just try to have as much logging as possible, trying to make things as error-proof as possible. And it is a very iterative process because every website's a little bit different. But in general, page object model is the #1 thing that I try to put in the framework. #2 would be a lot of polling weights and try to see how those things are behaving. And I gotta say, even though I have the patterns, every time I implement testing against a new site, I learn something new. And that's kind of the beauty of programming, really, is that you are learning something new every time you go through.
Excellent.
Thank you, Alan.
All right, so I see a question here about what.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say, there's a question there for you.
Yes, I see the question about logging mechanism. Do I utilize? I use a combination of console write and log. It's really just any way that I can get information out that's persisted. Is one better than another? I would say no. It's really about how comfortable you are with the tools that are available. There is no wrong solution. So Sabrina, I only saw that one question. Were there others?
No, I believe that's it. Oh no, there's one more here from John Gass. How do you handle AJAX bootstrap animation issues?
AJAX bootstrapping animation issues. AJAX is always going to be something that is going to be kind of tricky because it is asynchronous. If you know the begin state, maybe that the animation is either hidden or is not available, but is already defined inside your HTML, you can go find that element. And if it is hidden, you can search for that particular string to change to maybe visible. Everything depends on the implementation, but in general, if you can look at the begin state and know what the intermediate state is and also the end state, you can actually try to catch that. On our site, I'm trying to go through a place where we have AJAX animation. Off the top of my head, we do have spinner bars. So when we log in, there are some spinner bars on page, and we have them loaded as hidden elements, but then they're visible and then they're hidden again. So I try to look for the case where I have loading displayed inside the HTML, inside the DOM object, and then I look for the visibility to go back to hidden. But again, it's kind of dependent on how your animation is implemented, but that might be a trick you can try. That's a big question.
Wonderful. I think that's it, actually. Okay, well, should you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to email us at services@xbosoft.com. We're happy to answer questions as and when you have them. Indeed, even Twitter @xbosoft. And we also log into facebook.com and Google+. So should you be on those social networks, please feel free to follow us and join the conversations. As well as the webinars, we also generate reports and white papers on various topics surrounding software testing. So I would really encourage you to join our community links and indulge in all the knowledge that we have out there. Thank you so much, Alan, for your presentation. That was brilliant. And thank you, Steve, as well, for co-hosting. As I said, we have recorded this session, so we will be emailing that out to you all. And we'll also be sending out the slides as well. So keep your eyes open for that email. Thank you, everybody. And you shall hear from us soon. Bye-bye.
Have a good one, Alan.
Thanks, folks. Hope you enjoyed the talk.
Very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.